My name is James, and I never thought my life would take such a dark turn. Lila, my wife, and I had always dreamed of a piece of land to call our own, a place where we could build our house and maybe, one day, raise our children. When we finally found a plot of land for sale in a rural area of the UK, it seemed like fate was smiling on us. The price was unbelievably low, and even with the broker's strange warning about the land including an old cemetery, we didn't hesitate. The cemetery had been abandoned for decades, consumed by vegetation. More of a historical curiosity than a threat. Or so we thought. But there was a reason for my urgency to buy the place. Something I didn't tell anyone, not even Lila. My family has a long history of mental illness. And recently, I started having strange dreams and disturbing visions that led me to believe that maybe I was on the same path. The doctors couldn't find anything wrong, but I needed a quiet place, away from the chaos and pressures of city life, a place where I could perhaps find some peace or answers to what was happening to me. The property was perfect, secluded and silent, except for the murmurs that started on the first night. Whispers that seemed to flow with the breeze between the ancient trees, indistinct words that made me question my sanity. And then there were the dreams, increasingly vivid, where I walked among the tombs in the moonlight, guided by a voice that whispered not only in my dreams, but also in the wind. These events marked the beginning of a series of events that would change my life forever. As the days passed, each discovery in the cemetery seemed to bring a new layer of terror to our new life, as if each stone removed revealed dark secrets long buried. Now, I can only relate what happened, in the hope that by sharing my story, something inside me might find some respite. Maybe by telling what we experienced, those voices will finally fall silent. On our first night, we decided to camp next to the cemetery. The idea was to get up early the next day and start clearing the land, but the night had other plans for us. With the tent set up, we settled down to sleep under a starry sky. Everything was quiet until the noises started. At first, they were just soft knocks, as if someone was ringing the door of a distant house. Leela was fast asleep, but I, already haunted by my own demons, stayed awake, listening. Everyone in the picture, a man, a woman, and 2 children, had their eyes crossed out in red pen, which gave us the shivers. Who would do something like that, and why? The presence of that photograph on the ground, especially with the crossed-out eyes, seemed like a bad omen. Something in that image, in the blacked-out faces, seemed to be watching us, silently accusing us. We put the photograph back in the box, but that night, as we tried to sleep, the image of that family invaded my dreams, speaking of buried secrets and forgotten sins. With each discovery, the cemetery seemed less like a piece of land and more like an archive of untold stories, each one darker than the last. Our dream house was rapidly turning into something out of a nightmare, but we were determined to find out more, to understand what these shadows from the past wanted to tell us. Those days became denser and darker. The dreams that invaded my nights began to take on clearer and more threatening forms. In the darkness of my closed eyes, I saw the family from the photograph again and again. They approached me in a dark and misty atmosphere, their crossed-out eyes still visible even in a dream. They accused me of disturbing eternal rest, of invading the sacred with my profane presence. The voices were harsh whispers that mingled with the wind that rattled the curtains of our temporary room. Lila, for her part, began to see shadowy figures wandering around our tent at night. On one such occasion, she woke me up, whispering that there was someone outside. When we peered through the tent screen, there was no one in sight, but the feeling of being watched was palpable, almost suffocating. The whispers in the wind seemed to carry words of warning, and the chill that accompanied these apparitions made the air almost freezing. One morning, after a particularly restless night, We found the photograph we had returned to the box, now out of it and next to our makeshift bed. How it had ended up there, none of us could explain. This event only increased our feeling that we were not alone, that the souls in that photo were somehow active and present, not just in our nightmares, but there, with us on that ground. The apparitions and dreams began to blend together, making it difficult to distinguish what was reality from what was a figment of our imagination or exhaustion. Every shadow seemed to hide a secret. Every nocturnal whisper seemed to be an invitation or a threat. I felt increasingly pulled into a story that I didn't fully understand, but which I was desperately trying to understand. Perhaps, I thought, this was the call my subconscious was waiting for when it chose this place. Not just an escape, but a revelation. As the days passed, the phenomena around us began to intensify. It wasn't just a question of sounds or nocturnal visions. Now, objects inside our tent moved without explanation. Books that we had left on a table next to our beds were found on the floor, pages open as if someone was reading them. An old mug we had brought with us began to rock on its own on the table, stopping only when I held it firmly. One afternoon, a storm formed abruptly and intensely. The sky, which had been clear minutes before, quickly became a blanket of dark clouds. The wind whistled through the trees and the rain hit the tent canvas hard. It was as if nature itself was trying to drive us away, or perhaps hide something we were too close to discovering. During this storm, shadows began to pass across the walls of the tent. They weren't simple distortions caused by the light of our torches. They had shapes and movements of their own, sliding along the walls as if they were patrolling the perimeter of our fragile shelter. Lila and I clung to each other, watching the parade of dark figures, each one passing quickly before disappearing. In a moment of silence between the thunder, Lila felt a cold hand touch her shoulder. She screamed, turning quickly to confront whoever was there, but there was no one visible. The sensation of that hand remained, a chill that wasn't from the air, a presence we couldn't see but definitely felt. It was clear that something or someone didn't want us to stay there. Every event seemed like a message to keep us away. But at the same time, something was pulling us deeper into the mysteries of that place. Tired of the disturbing events and determined to find answers, Lila and I decided that we needed to find out more about the history of the land and the cemetery. With this in mind, we went to the local library, hoping that the old records might offer us some insight. There, amongst the dust and piles of forgotten books, we discovered old newspapers and documents that talked about the area. A yellowed newspaper clipping revealed a macabre story. Decades ago, an entire family had been brutally murdered in the cemetery, a tragedy that shocked the local community. The victims were a couple and their 2 children, killed in mysterious and violent circumstances. The news report mentioned that the bodies were never recovered, and the murders remained unsolved. A mystery that was apparently forgotten over time. This discovery made us even more uneasy, but it also brought a new understanding of the presences we felt. Perhaps those souls were still seeking justice or simply peace, trapped in this world by the trauma of their last moments. With this new information, we felt a mixture of fear and compassion. We decided that we had to do something to help these souls find rest. The next day, we returned to the cemetery with the intention of locating any trace of the bodies that might have been buried there without the proper honors. Equipped with shovels, we started digging near the oldest graves, guided by an inexplicable instinct. It was exhausting work, and with each shovelful of earth removed, the atmosphere around us seemed to grow heavier, as if we were carefully watching our every move. This desperate search for answers and the peace of lost souls consumed us completely, turning our days into a sequence of excavations and wakeful nights, always on the lookout for the signs and sounds that the cemetery offered us. We were determined to discover the truth hidden beneath that soil, no matter how much it might upset the order of things there. During a particularly cloudy afternoon, while digging near the center of the cemetery, our shovels finally touched something more solid than earth. Carefully, we removed the layer of soil to reveal the remains of a skeleton. It was a macabre encounter, bones mixed with bits of rotting tissue, but there was something else there, a palpable energy that seemed to be released by the discovery. As we looked at the bones, a wave of cold energy washed over us. The air around us became dense, almost visible, and the sound of the wind was replaced by a deep silence. It was as if time had stopped, and for a moment we were suspended in a space where only we and the spirits existed. Then the manifestations began more intensely and clearly than ever before. There, amongst the dust and piles of forgotten books, we discovered old newspapers and documents that talked about the area. A yellowed newspaper clipping revealed a macabre story. Decades ago, an entire family had been brutally murdered in the cemetery, a tragedy that shocked the local community. The victims were a couple and their 2 children, killed in mysterious and violent circumstances. The news report mentioned that the bodies were never recovered, and the murders remained unsolved. A mystery that was apparently forgotten over time. This discovery made us even more uneasy, but it also brought a new understanding of the presences we felt. Perhaps those souls were still seeking justice or simply peace, trapped in this world by the trauma of their last moments. With this new information, we felt a mixture of fear and compassion. We decided that we had to do something to help these souls find rest. The next day, we returned to the cemetery with the intention of locating any trace of the bodies that might have been buried there without the proper honors. Equipped with shovels, we started digging near the oldest graves, guided by an inexplicable instinct. It was exhausting work, and with each shovelful of earth removed, the atmosphere around us seemed to grow heavier, as if we were carefully watching our every move. This desperate search for answers and the peace of lost souls consumed us completely, turning our days into a sequence of excavations and wakeful nights, always on the lookout for the signs and sounds that the cemetery offered us. We were determined to discover the truth hidden beneath that soil, no matter how much it might upset the order of things there. During a particularly cloudy afternoon, while digging near the center of the cemetery, our shovels finally touched something more solid than earth. Carefully, we removed the layer of soil to reveal the remains of a skeleton. It was a macabre encounter, bones mixed with bits of rotting tissue, but there was something else there, a palpable energy that seemed to be released by the discovery. As we looked at the bones, a wave of cold energy washed over us. The air around us became dense, almost visible, and the sound of the wind was replaced by a deep silence. It was as if time had stopped, and for a moment we were suspended in a space where only we and the spirits existed. Then the manifestations began more intensely and clearly than ever before. Ghostly figures began to emerge from the fog that was forming around the cemetery. They were sharper than anything we had seen so far. Figures of men, women, and children, all dressed in clothes from another era. They didn't speak, but their eyes told stories of lives brutally interrupted, of despair and endless waiting. The voices, now clearly audible, were no longer just whispers. They were cries, accusations, pleas for justice that echoed through the air like a chorus of despair. Each voice seemed imbued with a raw and powerful emotion, a demand for attention that we couldn't ignore. The energy around these apparitions was so intense that we could almost touch it, a force that enveloped us and pressed down on our chests, making it difficult to breathe. They were moments of pure terror, but also of deep sadness. We realized that these souls were not trying to scare us, but to communicate the injustice of their unsolved deaths, the weight of being trapped in a place of memory and pain. Our determination to help them only grew with these revelations, despite our fear of being so close to the supernatural in such an intense and palpable way. At that moment, when we decided that we would try to leave the grounds to seek more help, or perhaps a specialist in paranormal phenomena, we realized that something had changed. We tried to follow the path back to the main road the same way we had come, but it seemed strangely longer and more confusing than we remembered. The trees seemed denser, the paths crooked, and every attempt to leave the cemetery took us back to its heart. The storm that had started during our excavations intensified, making visibility almost zero. The raindrops hit hard, and the wind howled through the trees, creating a deafening noise that made communication difficult. We were wet, cold, and increasingly desperate, realizing that we were somehow trapped within the confines of that cemetery. As we tried to find a way out, the spirit figures we had seen earlier began to manifest again, this time with frightening intensity. They seemed to form an invisible barrier around the perimeter of the grounds. Every time we approached the edge of the cemetery, the apparitions became clearer and their voices louder, as if warning us not to try to leave. As night fell, our desperation grew. The feeling of being watched was constant, and attempts to communicate with the spirits were met with hostility and symbolic violence. Branches broke abruptly next to us, and aggressive whispers filled the air, increasingly threatening. We were trapped, imprisoned by forces we didn't fully understand. Every attempt to escape thwarted by the invisible guardians of this troubled resting place. Resigned to our inability to leave the cemetery, and with the storm still roaring around us, we decided that our only option was to spend another night there, hoping that dawn would bring some relief or clarity. The tension between us was palpable. Every sound, every shadowy movement intensified the fear we were already feeling. The hours dragged by slowly, and every minute was torture, a test of our sanity. During that night, the spirits began to manifest themselves in a way we had never seen before. They didn't just wander around or talk to us. They began to recreate scenes from their own deaths. It was like watching a macabre theater play, where the actors were shadows from the past, condemned to repeat their last moments of life. We unwittingly became the audience for these terrible reenactments, each scene more vivid and detailed than the last. The voices of the children, the screams of the adults, the muffled sound of fighting, and the tragic ending were repeated, each cycle more intense. The pain and despair of these souls was almost tangible, and the strength of their emotions completely enveloped us, binding us not only physically, but also emotionally to the terrain. Our empathy for these spirits grew, even as our fear consumed us. Forced to confront these horrific visions, we realized that our presence there was perhaps not a coincidence or a mistake, but a part of something bigger. A call to bear witness and perhaps help solve the torments of these spirits. The night progressed, and with every hour that passed, we felt that we were being consumed not only by terror, but also by the sadness of these tormented souls. When dawn finally arrived, bringing with it an eerie silence and a momentary calm, Lila and I felt deeply exhausted, both physically and emotionally. The storm had passed, and with the light of day, the spiritual manifestations seemed to recede, giving us a brief respite. Despite our tiredness, this brief period of calm gave us hope that perhaps we could finally leave that place. We took the opportunity to try one last time to find a way out of the cemetery. Our spirits, although shaken, were determined not to give up. We started walking towards what seemed to be the edge of the land, each step an effort against the fear that it would all start again. But as we advanced, a strange mist began to form, thick and disorientating, altering the landscape around us. The more we tried to walk out of the terrain, the more it seemed to expand infinitely. The trees seemed to multiply and the paths closed behind us, as if the terrain itself were alive and aware of our movements. The realization that we couldn't leave the place became inevitable. We were somehow trapped there, connected to the souls and secrets that the cemetery held. Coming to terms with our situation, Lila and I finally stopped, accepting that the land, with its mysteries and its lost souls, was now part of our existence. The decision to buy the land, driven by my desire for isolation and peace, had led us to a destiny we could never have imagined. Now we were linked to those souls, perhaps as guardians of their stories, or perhaps as two more spirits condemned to wander among the tombs. As the sun rose, bringing light to a new day, we knew that somehow our life as we knew it was over. There was no turning back, only the acceptance that our new reality was intertwined with the supernatural, and that perhaps somehow this was always meant to be.